Greetings once again, fellow guitar travellers. It's Rowan J. Parker here with part 4 of soloing on static dominant chords. And this lesson is all about the use of chromatics, or passing tones as they are otherwise known. And we'll learn that we can pretty much play an entire chromatic scale and still produce musical results. So let's get straight into it. We're going to start looking at the chromatic scale against our trusty A7 chord. Let's do it. Right, now before we do the theory, let's have a brief discussion of the chromatic scale and why it's important and, in my opinion, generally overlooked. Most guitar players have learnt the chromatic scale at one time or other. This sort of thing. Which indeed is a great exercise and can really help develop good left hand dexterity and, right hand alternate picking synchronization. However, it's usually just left like that. It's an exercise that gets shown to a student, they practice the exercise, and then that is it. And this is a pity because there's a great deal of colour and interest to be had in the chromatic scale, and when it's carefully handled, it can really, very easily increase the level of your harmonic interest when you improvise. And if you think this is cheating, well, it's not. Jazz players have been doing this for years, playing chromatic scales as a way of getting some very quick and easy colour into their improvisation. So it's a perfectly legitimate approach. So let's go ahead and look at a 1-octave chromatic scale, starting on A, and we will compare it against our benchmark A7 chord and learn exactly how all the notes in the scale fit against the chord, so we can really start to appreciate, why the scale sounds the way it does, which notes will sound strong, which notes will start to sound dissonant, and how to handle these sorts of sounds. Alright, so let's do that. Okay, now here's a 1-octave chromatic scale starting on the note of A. Sounds like this one. And it is chromatic, but nevertheless, let's look at all the pitches. We've got A sharp or B flat, B, C, C sharp or D flat, D, D sharp or E flat, E, F, F sharp or G flat, G, G sharp or A flat, and then the octave A. Right, let's compare each and every one of these notes against our A7 chord to try and understand exactly how these notes will relate to the chord. The first note, A. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that A is the root of A7, so it's the most safe and inside note you could possibly play. The next note is A sharp or B flat. In relationship to the A7 chord, this is the flat 9 of the chord, flat 9 of an A7 chord. It's the interval of a minor second, and if we compound that over the octave, it becomes a flat 9. Now, a flat 9 on a dominant chord is quite a colorized sound, but is nevertheless a very common sound to apply to dominant chords. So although it's quite dissonant initially, it's a very common colour on dominant chords. So it really is fine to use this note. It's not going to be a problem. The next note is B. In relationship to our A7 chord, it is the 9th, 2nd or 9th. So this is a great colour to play in the dominant chord. Interesting, colorised, and certainly not dissonant in any way at all. So it's going to be fine. The third note would be C. Now, in relationship to the A7 chord, this is the sharpened 9th of our dominant chord. So if we play a C note on top of the A, it will sound like a sharp 9, which is another quite common extended colour on a dominant chord. I'm sure you've heard him played this chord before, A7 sharp 9, often called the Jimi Hendrix chord, because he popularised it. So, although again slightly dissonant, it's an acceptable colour, so that should be fine as well. The next note, C sharp, very safe. This is the major third of the A7 chord, no problem with that one. The next note, D. In relationship to the A, this is the 4th or 11th, and will produce the sound of A7 sus or A11. So again, it's a nice cool note, works fine. The next note is D sharp, which is in relationship to the A7 chord, the sharpened 4th, or more commonly called the flattened 5th. And this is the note you find in the blues scale. You play the blues scale. And partly because of that, it's become a very acceptable in colour note to put on a dominant chord. Flat 5 on a dominant chord, not much of a problem there. So that's fine as well. And then the next note we have is E, which is the 5th of the chord. It's incredibly inside, no problem with that one. And now we come to the next note, which is F. Alright, now in relationship to the A7 chord, F would be a minor 6th above, alright? So in terms of our relationship to the chord, it would be the sharpened 5th. It can either be described as a sharpened 5th or a minor 6th interval. We spell it as a sharp 5, then we're going to produce A7 sharp 5. So again, another coloured note on a dominant chord, but still it's going to be alright. And then the next note is F sharp or G flat, and against our A chord it's the 6th or 13th. So it's a nice colour note. And then we're on to the note of G. This is a scale tone now. G in relationship to the A7 chord is the flattened 7th of the chord. So it's a strong chord tone, okay? And then the final note we have is G sharp or A flat. And this will be, in relationship to the A7 chord, the major 7 interval. So this is potentially dissonant because it's possibly going to clash against our minor 7th interval in the chord, but if we just pass through it on the route to somewhere else, then it's going to be absolutely fine. And the last note, of course, is going to be A, and that's the root, so that's going to be fine. So you see that actually there's hardly any notes at all in the chromatic scale that won't sound at least okay, or at the worst interesting, against our dominant chord. And that's the reason you can play a chromatic scale over a dominant 7th chord. Dominant 7 chords accept the widest range of colour and dissonant of all chords, because the number of extensions you get in a dominant chord is wider than those on any other chord type. And what this really boils down to is the fact that, you know, it will accept pretty much any note in a chromatic scale, and we can really start leveraging this idea to produce some cool sounds. Okay, now that we have looked at in some depth our chromatic scale in relationship to our A7 chord, I think what we're going to do now is talk about, you know, the balance of sound within the chromatic scale. So there are 12 tones in a chromatic scale, and we can divide these up into what we call consonant sounds, that is sounds which will tend to sound more in tune with the chord, and dissonant sounds, that is sounds which will tend to sound less in tune with the chord. So of these 12 tones, seven are going to be consonant sounds because they are linked to or derived from the scale that will fit over this chord, which would be A mixolydian. The 5 remaining sounds are all various degrees of dissonance, and as we'll see in a little while, these 5 notes produce a very interesting phenomenon indeed, which we'll be able to use as well. So let's begin by looking at the consonant sounds. Of the 7 consonant sounds, 4 of them are incredibly consonant because they are just chord tones. An A7 chord is A, C sharp, E and G. And probably in order of consonants, the most consonant is A, which is the root, followed by E, which is the 5th of the chord, which is an extremely passive sounding note. Then C sharp, which is the major 3rd, and then G natural, which is the flattened 7th of the chord. Any one of these notes will sound good on the chord. They will all sound correct and in tune. The G will probably sound, you know, the most interesting because you'll be highlighting the flatted 7th of the chord, and by the same token A would sound the least interesting because it's the root. However, all these 4 notes are very much in tune with the chord. So let's look at the 3 remaining consonant notes. These notes are what we might call colour tones on the chord. We have this note, B, which in relationship to the chord is the 9th. We have the 9th. And then we have D, which in relationship to our A7 chord is the 4th or 11, producing an A11 or A7 sus sound. And the other colour tone we have is F sharp, which is the 6th or 13th. So these are all really nice notes to stack on top of your dominant chord. So those are the 7 consonant notes. Let's look at the 5 remaining notes, which are dissonances. The first note we're going to look at is E flat. E flat. Okay? In relationship to our chord, it is the flattened 5th. And then we have F, though technically should be spelled E sharp because it is the sharpened 5th of the chord, and the 5th would be the E note. So, however, flat 5, sharp 5, and then the G sharp note, which is our major 7th interval, that is the major 7th of the dominant 7th chord, so that's going to be a fairly strong dissonance. That's going to sound quite out of tune to our ears. And then the next note is A sharp or B flat, which would be the flat 9, and the final note is C, or in this case we'd have to spell it B sharp because it's the sharpened 9th. Okay, sharp 9. Now here's an extremely interesting phenomenon. If we take the 5 dissonant notes and just place them in order, look at what we get. Which actually is an F minor pentatonic scale. Now, this seems completely bonkers and against all things that would seem intuitive, but if you really want to create an outside and dissonant sound on an A7 chord, you play F minor pentatonic because it contains all the colour extensions: flat 5, sharp 5, major 7, flat 9 and sharp 9. I don't recommend you do this on your pop gig, you know, because it'll probably sound awful, but if you're doing it on one of those kind of cool jazz or fusion gigs, it will sound absolutely awesome. There'll be much more about how to use outside sounding pentatonic scales on subsequent videos, but I thought I'd mention it here because it's just an interesting fact to know about, you know, the balance of consonance and dissonance within a scale. Alright, so that's us looked at the two categories, consonant and dissonant sounds. Let's now begin to talk about how to handle the passing tones or chromatic sounds to make sure that when we actually use them in a musical situation, it's going to sound good and it's not going to just sound like a bunch of random chromatic nonsense. Okay, so that's next. When I explain this to my more advanced students, that they can use a chromatic scale and the reasons they can use it, oftentimes when they start trying to use it, it just sounds like this. It doesn't really work. It doesn't sound musical, it doesn't sound interesting, it certainly doesn't sound jazzy. It just sounds very weird and bizarre. And the reason that it doesn't sound good is because that they are not keeping in mind what chord they're actually playing over. Now, the chord that we're playing over is A7, and we've already seen where the consonant notes are. 4 scale tones and 3 colour tones, and the rest of them are balances of dissonance. So when you use chromatic ideas, you must be exceptionally careful that you resolve your line onto something that is going to sound consonant, unless you are so confident about the handling of dissonance that you can make it work. The interesting thing is that all the truly amazing players can make any note sound fantastic, whereas less experienced improvisers, you know, they can't handle the notes which are, you know, technically not in tune. So this is about understanding exactly what is in the chord you're playing over and how the notes that you're playing relate to the chord. So let's give you a couple of ways that you can approach these chromatic ideas. Here's the first way, a very simple way. Let's take this scale. Which is A Mixolydian. And all we're going to do is basically fill it in chromatically. And you probably hear that even though there were a lot of passing tones there, we still could clearly hear this tonality in our minds. So here's the first thing to try. Take all the regular scales you know, and in my case I'm very much a 3 note per string guy. Take all the regular scales you know and just fill them in. And don't even worry too much about exactly what the notes are, as long as you keep in mind the note you want to end on. And if you try and ensure that the note you end on is a strong chord tone, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, then this chromatic dissonance will pass by without too much of a problem, because most of the time you're going to be on scale tones, and when you are on a dissonant chromatic tone, or what we might call passing tone, as long as we don't linger on that note, the ear does not perceive it to sound too dissonant. So you see that although that was pretty much this, it still sounded okay because the line was resolved. So try and think about it this way when you're using chromatics, that if you play chromatic all the time and it's outside all the time, it will probably not sound so good, and it'll be difficult for the listener as well. If however you play inside, that's playing combinations of strong chord tone with some interesting colour tone, and then also put inside your line some of these chromatic passing tones, so that you go from inside to an outside sound when you use some chromatics, and then crucially resolving back in and resolving the line on a chord tone or a strong colour tone otherwise, then it will sound correct. The other fact to note about chromaticism is that quite often it'll work because of linear direction. And really what I mean by that is, you can play something that say sounds like this. And it sounds okay because the notes are all generally going in the same direction, and therefore even though there are several notes which technically are incorrect, the ear will accept them because they pass by quite rapidly, and because you're being clear about the linear direction of your idea, which is to say that it has to resolve. So what I would encourage you to do is experiment with this stuff, taking all the scales you know, fill them in chromatically, and then when you attempt to use this stuff, make sure your line finishes on a strong chord tone or a nice colour tone. And the other thing to say about this is, as you get more and more experience with using chromatic, it's really a matter of confidence to be certain that what you play is going to sound good. There's a lot of times when I play something and I know theoretically it is wrong, and yet the musical outcome is okay because I'm really strong with the direction with which I'm playing. That is to say that if you play an idea with enough confidence, your listener will tend to assume, well, he must have meant that, you know, and in fact I do mean it. So even though it's theoretically and technically wrong, the ear will start to perceive it as being right because the improviser is very clear with their direction. So I hope that helps you out in terms of beginning to control some of this chromatic dissonance. To be honest, it does take quite a long time to, develop, and it's something that should certainly be worked on, just like anything else in your improvisation. But it gives another really nice option for soloing on chords. I would encourage you to really get into this way of playing. However, once it is mastered, again, like any other approach, don't use it all the time. So for instance, if you're basically a blues player, use pentatonic scales all the time, well, I think that starts to sound boring after a while. If you use modes, and use modes all the time, it starts to sound boring after a while. So any sound, one sound, becomes kind of wearing on the ear after a while. But if you have like a whole bunch of sounds that you can use, well then that becomes pretty interesting, because then you're painting with a very broad palette, just like a very fine artist, this colour, this colour, this colour, and you can draw hopefully a very interesting, exciting and colourful musical picture. And that's the idea behind all these approaches, is actually to make you a better soloist. So once you get over all the theory, of which of course there is quite a lot to learn, the end goal, and you should never forget this, the end goal is to make real music. So the other piece of advice I'll give you is that everything that you learn, whatever it is, scales, pentatonic scales, modes, chromatic stuff, arpeggios, whatever it is that you learn, apply this into your playing as soon as you can. Because if it becomes an abstract thing that you've just learnt, that has no real function or place in your playing, it's not going to be very useful. You may as well not have bothered to learn it. Me personally, I don't learn anything which could be just construed as an exercise. It's got to have some musical application or musical value. So, this is the final advice. Whatever you learn, apply, because that's what's going to make the difference between you being a less accomplished player and being a more accomplished player. Alright, well, that about wraps it up for the chromatic thing. I'm going to stop talking now. We're going to give you a little further demonstration of applying some chromatic ideas over our A7 vamp. And I hope you can see how I'm doing it, and hopefully if you practice it you'll be able to do it as well. Alright, so we hope you enjoy this little improvisation very much. Here we go with our chromatic application solo. Let's do it. we hope you enjoyed that very much. That wraps up the chromatic lesson today. Now we've got one final part to do of this soloing on dominant chord series, and that is looking at some more exotic scales. We're going to look at the application of whole tone and diminished scales for some really interesting outside sounds. I would like to encourage you to head on over to my website, which is www.rowanjparker.com, and there's all manner of guitar stuff on there. There's lots of jazz, there's stuff for beginners, intermediate level players, and there's also a whole bunch of shred, because when I'm not jazzing, I like to shred. So it's been a blast showing you all this stuff. I hope you found it interesting and useful. It does take quite a long time to absorb, so if your brain is about to explode, just go back and watch it again as many times as you need until it starts to sink in. And the crucial thing is, apply. That's what in the end is going to make you awesome. So thanks very much for watching. I've been Rowan J. Parker. Goodbye.